So welcome to this webinar. I will just start by saying that the webinar is recorded. So you're aware of this. We would of course like to see your faces, but we're also completely fine if you would like to take your face or your name off the screen. And the recording is placed on the GLP website afterwards for people who can't join today live. Yeah, so for those just entering now, just to be aware that the webinar is recorded. Okay, so I will start by saying welcome on behalf of the Telecoupling Working Group coordinators. My name is Cecilie Friis. I'm at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm coordinating this working group together with Maria Jose Barola, Johanna Konen and Juliet Seringer, who is joining from different places in the world. And we are really happy to invite you to this 9th webinar of our working group, where we have this really interesting topic, we think at least, on the telecoupled implications of this new EU regulations on deforestation-free supply chain. And we have invited 3 speakers to get the discussion going. So the format today will be that we have Almut. Would you change the slide, Johanna? Thank you. So we have Almut Schilling-Wacker-Flor from Osnabrück University, and Myron Bastos-Lima from the Stockholm Environment Institute, and Armando Valdez-Valesquez from the WIS Academy for Nature and the University. I will not attempt to pronounce it correctly. Maybe you can help me out when you start, Armando. And we've invited these speakers to give us short inputs on their take on this question: how can telecoupling research be used to advance our understanding of this new EU regulations? What should we be aware of? What should we look out for? What are challenges and opportunities? And while our speakers give short inputs, you're welcome to put comments or questions in the chat, and we will follow up the inputs with a general discussion across the 3 inputs, but also with your comments and questions. So that's the format of this hour we have to spend together today. But before we do that, Johanna Konen has agreed to just give a little bit of context on this new EU regulation, so we are all kind of on the same page as to what we are discussing today. So, Johanna.
Yes, perfect. So I will just provide a little bit of background on the EU regulation on deforestation-free supply chains. Sometimes it's also referred to as EU regulation on deforestation-free products. And the objectives of this regulation are to that the key goods placed on the EU market will no longer contribute to deforestation and forest degradation in the EU and elsewhere in the world. So it applies to commodities imported to the EU, but also exported from it. And of course, I would say a secondary aim, or one aim, is through that also to reduce carbon emissions that are associated with deforestation. So a few key features of the regulation are to tackle deforestation, regardless of whether it's legal or illegal. That's quite a change to the current EU timber regulation. I will say a few words about that soon. And to implement strict traceability requirements linked to the commodities and basically really get the geographical information or the geolocation of the farmland where these products are produced, and to introduce a country benchmarking system. I'll explain it in a bit. So the new regulation will, for now, apply to 7 commodities, which are soy, timber, cocoa, cattle, palm oil, coffee, and rubber, and also the derived products. So, for example, beef, furniture, chocolate, leather, and so on are also covered under this regulation. And this list might actually be expanded in the future, but for now it's only these 7 commodities that are covered. So a few words about the timeline. So in 2021, the European Commission adopted the proposal for the regulation on deforestation-free supply chains. And then about a year later, there was a provisional political agreement between the European Parliament and the Council to adopt this. And just 1 month ago, the Parliament already adopted this new regulation, so it's formally adopted by the Parliament. And now we just wait for the decision by the Council. I mean, it's more just the formal decision. But this summer, this regulation is expected into force. So basically this or probably coming month. And once it's into force, operators and traders will have 18 months to implement the new rules. So and the new regulation will repeal the EU timber regulation that was, I think, initiated in 2003 through the FLEG Action Plan. So what is this regulation about? It will basically implement new due diligence rules for companies. So all relevant companies will have to conduct strict due diligence if they place products on the market or on the EU market, also export them. And the products need to be deforestation-free. And the cutoff date is the 21st of December 2020. So commodities produced on land that was deforested after that are not allowed to be placed on the EU market. And they need to be legal. So they need to be compliant with all relevant applicable laws that are enforced in the countries, including human rights and the rights of indigenous people. That was, I think, added in the process while the new regulation was negotiated. And the penalties for non-compliance will be up to 4%. So fines will be up to 4% of the total annual turnover of the companies if they don't comply with this regulation. So how is such a due diligence system, or what are the elements of a due diligence system? So there are 3 key steps of a due diligence system. So first of all, companies, there's an information requirement where companies have to make due diligence statements and submit that to the EU and conduct a risk assessment. And if they see any risks associated with their commodities, they have to take mitigation measures. And these 3 steps are complemented by reporting requirements. So the companies will need to collect precise geographical information on where they source their products. And actually certification and other third-party verified schemes can be used during the risk assessment procedure, but they will not substitute the due diligence system. So operators still need to take full responsibility as regards to the due diligence. And inspections will be carried out by member states, competent authorities. And third parties such as NGOs will be entitled to submit concerns if they see issues of non-compliance to these competent authorities, who will then do checks on these complaints that have been submitted. So the ultimate goal, of course, is to increase transparency in the supply chains. So operators and traders must upload due diligence statements to a centralized online information system. Maybe for me, the distinction between operators and traders was not clear in the beginning. So the difference is operators are those actors that place the products on the EU market for the first time, and traders are those who then supply it to other actors in the supply chain. So operators are those which really put it on the EU market for the first time. And member state authorities will have access to the relevant information on the commodities and products, and they have access to this digital system. And also the wider public will have access to this data, but it will be anonymized to foster this transparency. So these are the some key information on the new regulation. I think I will leave it at that. We can discuss it later, and I will hand over to Almut, who will give the short little input. Over to Almut.
Okay, so thank you very much, all of you, to organize this very interesting event. And for me, like the question that you pose of how a telecoupling perspective could be used for analyzing or better understanding this new regulation, the European Union regulation on deforestation-free products, but also there is a wider array of new laws that adopt or that are built on a human rights and environmental due diligence approach that could that will interact also with this EU regulation, and that could also be analyzed from a telecoupling perspective. And I think that this perspective to look at distant socio-ecological systems and actors involved and transnational linkages can be useful, like for many purposes, to study like different processes and impacts surrounding these new laws. And I would like to share some reflections with you of my own research agenda that has been inspired clearly by a telecoupling perspective. So first of all, I would like to ask a bit the question of what could we expect, or what we would probably like to see, like what kind of changes we would like to see in consequence of the adoption of these new regulations. And I think that if we think about effectiveness, on the one hand, what is the attempt of the new regulation is that companies change their management systems and also their practices along the whole supply chain, on both sides of the supply chain. Then also that there are tangible sanctions and consequences, what previously has been like almost absent in the regulation of global supply chains, where we have seen like a dominance of voluntary measures. And then something that also business and human rights scholars have put a lot of emphasis on this, I think, is that the new laws should also lead to a remediation of negative impacts and also to access to remedy of victims especially in the producing sides of these commodities that you showed in the beginning. And I think for studying to what extent like these aims of the new regulations can really be achieved in practice, it is very important to look at both sides of the supply chain, and also to look at actors, how actors perceive and make use of and implement the new laws. And then if we want to understand to what extent they are really somehow effective, and these like such a kind of theory of change is really activated, it's important also to look at the transnational linkages between these actors from the demand side and supply side. And I prepared 2 slides. So one is about the question of how companies really understand their new obligations of implementing human rights and environmental due diligence. So in this case, with a focus on deforestation. And there, if we just look at the demand side, what we can see are like company reports. We can see how companies assess risks, what kind of mitigation and prevention measures they take, how they track the progress. Then we can see what kind of grievance mechanisms are they adopting, if there is some dynamism because of the adoption of the law. But actually what we find out about the consequences on the ground and to what extent this really works is limited. And there I made a study with my colleague Maria-Therese Gustafsson, with whom I have collaborating quite closely on these topics. And we have seen like how companies in France comply with the new French duty of vigilance law, which somehow has been a pioneer to the new regulation and directive at EU level. And what we have seen is that many companies, they tell us, or they told us, and they report all kinds of measures that they are adopting, like action plans and audits and self-assessments of suppliers, etc. But also like people working within the companies and being responsible for these systems, they told us very clearly that very often they don't know if all their efforts really help to improve situations on the ground. And I think for finding this out, it's very important to shift the focus also to the supply side and to make more context-sensitive research and ask to what extent suppliers and producers really change or improve their practices, or if we see other kinds of compliance, like more symbolic forms of compliance, or even like shifting of supply chains, like maybe Myron afterwards will talk more about this, because this is also an hypothesis that maybe suppliers in the global south will shift like more sustainable products to Europe and less sustainable to other markets. And then it would also be important like to see like who really benefits and who loses in consequence of new obligations. Like there is this assumption, and something that we also saw in the European Union timber regulation, that sometimes for smallholders and small producers, it has been particularly difficult like to comply with new obligations and of reporting and bureaucracies, and yeah, have a clear documentation, etc. And then it would be very important like to have these feedback loops to understand much better like what is really happening on the ground, and is it really working or not. And this could then also affect the institutional design of the laws. And then like if we look at the authoritative standards about human rights and environmental due diligence, like the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights or the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, they put a lot of emphasis that it's very important to consult and have participation, meaningful participation of stakeholders and rights holders in all stages of a due diligence system. So it will also be important to look at to what extent companies really in their risk assessment, when they evaluate their mitigation and prevention measures, when they have their grievance mechanisms, to have a close eye on the question to what extent they really do this in an inclusive manner. So who do they consult? What kind of information do they really have from local places, from grassroots organizations, from rights holders? And in our own analysis, we have seen that the companies that we have analyzed, they have been quite weak in regard to this. So often they have just taken into account some very big and visible international NGOs, but on the grassroots level, there have been very little participation or use of grievance mechanism or awareness that this even exists. And then another question would also be like, how are these human rights and environmental due diligence systems of companies, how are they shaped by domestic policies? And I think there we can see, for instance, in Brazil, how important it is that certain preconditions are really available, are existing. Like companies often make use of public databases, and it's very important if laws are enforced, because if not, there could be very easy like loopholes and informal processes that allow suppliers to undermine, or also subsidiaries and suppliers, like to undermine environmental and human rights standards, and then it becomes very difficult to implement and enforce such obligations in a meaningful way. And then, so this would be like the first part, like the due diligence system, and then the second part, Johanna, could you change, please? Thank you. The second part would be the question of accountability dynamics and then access to remedy. So there, the question is like, if we want that human rights and environmental due diligence laws, like the regulation we are talking about today, if we want that they work, we need, I think, to activate different kinds of accountability dynamics. So this could be legal accountability by filing lawsuits. This could be reputational accountability by naming and shaming companies, pressuring them to adopt more meaningful systems of human rights and environmental due diligence. Or it could also be like supervisory accountability. For instance, in the case of Germany, there is a competent authority that needs to oversee and supervise what companies do. And in the case of non-compliance, there should be sanctions and consequences for the companies, like the exclusion from public procurement, or that they are not allowed to import certain forest risk commodities, for instance, to the European market. And also, I think if we want that such accountability dynamics work, it's very important that we have very strong transnational linkages. And there, I think we can see important constraints, because if we look at the design of the laws that we have until now, there has been a critique that they have been rather weak in relation to access to remedy also for victims. So this would be like a disincentive for actors from producing sites to really participate, to put their grievances, to try to file lawsuits. There are not so many possibilities for victims from the Global South to participate. And then we can also see that until now there is a big power imbalance between companies and accountability holders. And I think also in this regard, the law could have been much stronger. Like, for instance, if we look at the case of Brazil, in Brazil, there is, for instance, a law proposal. I don't know if it will be successful or not, but it's very interesting because it contains a lot of measures that aim to tip the power balance, like in favor of accountability holders and rights holders. And we could learn from that also for the European laws, maybe for changing them also in the future and making them more stringent. But what we see is that in practice, it's often very difficult, like to establish a clear causality between what a company is doing and impacts on the ground. So often we don't have good traceability, and there is a lack of knowledge about certain impacts. And it can be very difficult to get to real consequences and sanctions for the companies, because there you need to show there is like a burden of proof. So you need to clearly show that the company didn't do enough. And then still it's very contested what human rights and environmental due diligence means, because companies understand something often very different to what civil society organizations would like to see. So I think, to conclude, it's very important that civil society organizations and rights holders, who often are the ones who most closely know about what is happening on the ground, what are the impacts, who are the ones often most affected, that they really play an important role, and that they have strong linkages also with civil society organizations or state organizations from the demand side. And then we should also not forget that it's not just about companies and civil society, but it will be very important what role state agencies that are involved on both sides of the supply chain, the demand side and the supply side, what role they will play, how proactive they will be to really enforce and give meaning to the new legal obligations. And I guess that Myron will talk to some of the issues that I already mentioned, but you asked me to finish like with questions. So I think that questions that I have in mind would be like, to what extent new laws and legal obligations like this regulation on deforestation-free products can help to really tip the power balance between companies and accountability holders mainly, or civil society organizations. And then what could be also strategies for making use of the new laws in a way that leads to more deep sustainability transformation instead of more symbolic compliance or some like minor reforms. So these are some of the questions I have in mind. And I'm curious to hear from you what you think, Myron.
All right. Thanks, Almut, and thanks the organizers and everyone for being here. For those who don't know me, Myron Bastos Lima. I am a research fellow at the SCI and research coordinator for TRACE. As this is a short pitch, I decided to do it without slides, and hopefully my words will get enough, will do enough to get your focus. I named this pitch, nevertheless, beyond the scope, because my perception, as I believe it has been that of many of you, is that these new laws from the EU have really come to dominate the debate. There is a lot of enthusiasm gathering around them. To be fair, those of us who have been in this midst for a few years didn't even think such a thing would be possible. We were still speaking of voluntary commitments and hoping the companies would get their things together. And suddenly this came, like, wow, it's dominating the scene. But of course, this brings risks, because then a lot of the telecoupling debate, which is very broad, becomes framed in terms of what the regulation seems to want to achieve, its limitations. We start framing our thinking in terms of its scope, which is obviously limited. It doesn't cover everything. It covers certain policy priorities from a European perspective on certain commodities and so on and so forth. So I thought we could zoom out a bit and think about beyond the scope in at least 3 ways. This is how I've organized the next few minutes. And this is nothing more than an invitation for all of us to broaden our thinking and view these European laws in a bigger perspective, in a larger perspective. And I hope some questions, policy questions, research questions will naturally become visible as I put my finger on a few things. What are those things? The first beyond the scope point has to do with other ecosystems. This is an easy one. Many of us have been noting how the focus on forests neglect other highly biodiverse and highly socially important ecosystems, such as the Cerrado in Brazil, but also the Chaco in Argentina and Paraguay, that have suffered disproportionately from land use change due to agricultural expansion, and yet they receive far less attention than so-called high forests and rainforests do. There is a device, as I understand, in the regulation whereby in September 2024, there will be a revision process and they will consider including that. There is, to be fair, a segment of the Cerrado that counts as forests and therefore is covered, but the bulk of it is not. But of course, a lot can happen. There is still a while until this enters into force. And then when there is a revision, if it is on schedule, in the background, a lot of the people say that actors are scrambling around as to how much clarity on implementation is there, people wanting more instruction from the EU, and the EU to an extent saying countries have to figure out how they're going to put systems in place and so forth. So I will not be shocked if things proceed a little more slowly than originally predicted. And of course, this means time is ticking, lands are being converted, and you do have the whole discussion about leakage. And it's not exclusively that now that a place such as the Amazon is more protected on an international level, they will flock away from there and then, okay, gather your things together, the cattle, move all your heads of cattle, let's go to the Cerrado now, folks. That's not necessarily how it happens, but think in terms of new investments and of a change in the push and pull factors. Now there is yet another push factor, basically staving off new investments from the Amazon to an extent, of course, whereas the Cerrado and the Chaco and other places are still seen as green lighted for the kinds of ecosystem destruction that have already proven to be so problematic. So what remains outside of the scope there, this part gets attention, but I think we cannot totally lose focus of them. And there is plenty of research to be done on how they're going to, what their fate is going to be. What is it that they're going to experience now under the new regulation, beyond the areas being covered by the new rules. And now I'm thinking of the one against deforestation. Due diligence, of course applies, but the implementation means and monitoring is not of the same level, as people studying the Cerrado or the Chaco can tell you. The second part has to do with other impacts. Understandably, there is a focus on trees, on land use change, on avoiding conversion of ecosystems, but what about everything else? I mean, we have livelihood issues, the equity issues to the extent that smallholders from commodities such as palm oil, cocoa could risk being excluded. There are some initial studies on that. But let's think beyond the individual sectors being targeted of that basket of commodities. Let's think about the landscapes as a whole, or even the regions, the countries in some cases. What are food security impacts? What is it that we're likely to see happening? There is some predictive research that we could be doing, and besides the empirical part of actually going to check out how those stakeholders understand it, and in time, what other consequences will these new policies going to have. Is it, when I stop to think about it, I wonder if what the policymakers expect is that we'll have a frozen picture of 2020. Okay, no more expansion here. Stay where you were. Don't expand further, but let's continue as things were. That's not quite how the world works. I mean, things are in constant evolution and change, and it's fine that you don't want them. Many of us don't want them to expand further onto forests because that's unsustainable. But then what is it that is going to happen? Are they going to expand elsewhere? Are they not going to expand, and then development will take place through other means? You're going to create maybe jobs in the cities. I mean, those economies will stagnate, or how is it? I'm not necessarily being super pro-growth here, but I'm just acknowledging that the economics of those landscapes are not going to be frost in time in 2020. So we need to also understand what kind of connections, teleconnections, will be existing between so-called consumer regions and those landscapes that are now being targeted by this policy. There's a whole realm of things beyond the scope that we can think about and identify. Finally, my last beyond the scope point has to do with thinking of these new policies within a broader policy context, which is something that I often fail to see. I mean, if you go and read the text of these policies, they are essentially at heart and in the letter about doing no harm. It's to make sure that we avoid It's to make sure that European consumers do not contribute. Everything is phrased in the negative. Somehow there seems to be an assumption about all these sectors being benign at heart, except for the deforestation. Of course, anything that has been studying corporate concentration, pesticide contamination, water use, land rights, biodiversity impacts of monocropping, you name it, this whole, it's not just the elephant on the room, it's Noah's Ark in the room. There are all sorts of things. And so how are we going to address those other things? Are there other policies to address those other things? It's legitimate and fine that there is a policy in place to make sure that certain noxious effects of the systems in place, namely deforestation, but also the other violations the due diligence directive seeks to address. It's great that we're putting more devices in place to avoid causing those problems. But then how are we, or how are policies seeking to transform what goes on there? Even if we are to think in terms of shifting to more sustainable agriculture, or to think of this in terms of transition theory, as some have started to. I mean, even in energy, which is the domain more studied by transitions, it's not that we try to keep, the fossil-based system in place, but just prevent the carbon from going to the atmosphere. There are new technologies, there are new ways of doing things that gradually may come to replace the old system. Where are these efforts in the case of deforestation? We would just want to keep the old system, but without the thorns, without the edges. So if we are to think more broadly, then what are the other policies? Think development aid, think technology transfer, think other realms of trade and exchange. What other channels of teleconnection between these regions could complement, could be part of a larger policy portfolio together with these new measures to achieve those broader transitions and change? I think these are questions that still very much remain unanswered, but I would seriously invite us to think beyond within the scope to those other, to the context of these new policies and tackle some of those questions. So these are some provocations and invitations I had in mind, and I'll pass it over then to Armando. Thank you.
Thank you, Myron, and thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this webinar. I'm gonna say the name of my university so that Cecile doesn't feel like she didn't say it. I'm a professor at the Universidad Peruana Cayetano Heredia. It's based in Lima. But I'm also a senior advisor for the WIS Academy for Nature and South American Hub. And just like Myron, I also thought that being it a small pitch or a short pitch, I would not use slides. And I also named it actually, not beyond the scope as he did, but from the South. So, and I went through this whole deforestation-free commodity law and the idea, the whole development of the same. And it was really interesting. Again, I think it's, and this is very negative from my side. Again, I'm speaking from the South, from the mostly producer side, is we're just putting a Band-Aid on something that is not going to change significantly the way we use resources and the amount of resources we use. So the patterns of consume are not really significantly going to be touched by this. That, again, doesn't mean we have to change it all at the same time, but I do think that in keeping in mind what Myron said is we have to take a step back and look at the big picture and see if this is really going to curb deforestation in the case of the Amazon. And especially, that's my site. And if it only will change where we source things, where we source resources, but we will not change the consumer patterns that make this great demand for more and more products. I know the EU is not the whole world, and maybe that's what's more frustrating is the fact that this is just one of the things that has been carried out, but there are other markets, and other markets mean other possibilities. So we might be talking about leakage, right? We will be talking about not leakage only on the source, but leakage on who receives the product. China doesn't have the same regulations that the EU has, and for some of the countries, especially along in South America or in Southeast Asia, China is a great market to look at. So I do think that there is a whole, and I'm going to call it coherence. There's a coherence at very different scales. There has to be coherence at the global scale of what trade and markets and deforestation-free products and supply chains should look like, but that conversation is not going on. Obviously, political situation doesn't help, but let's say that should be one of the conversations that we should be having. But there's also the coherence along the supply chain. Most of the problems, at least in the Amazon, and I'm going to stay in the Amazon, not like Myron, I'm not going to defend Cerrado and other places I should, but I'm going to stay in the Amazon for this. Is the coherence between the policies at the national level of those countries that are part of the Amazon. We are not even coherent amongst ourselves in regards to what is a forest, what is deforestation, what strategy should we use, and so on. So the economic development in economic activities that is happening around into the Amazon, how coherent are these policies with what the EU is now passing? Is it possible for these countries to foster a deforestation-free economy? And at what scale does that happen? Does it have to be national? Does it have to be subnational, provincial, district, municipal, communal? What level are we talking about when we say that the producers will be fosters toward deforestation-free products. And this also obviously is linked to a vision, right? Are we envisioning the same patterns of consumerism in the world, but with the Amazon kind of like it is in 2020? Or are we visualizing that in order to keep the Amazon as it is and regenerate it or even expand it if needed, patterns of consumerism have to change? So at the level of vision, at the level of policy, on the ground, scale, these questions of coherence are really, really important. And that means trying to ask questions about analyzing the political landscape in each one of our countries and how they're aligned or not aligned with what the EU will be asking for. And we have 18 months to comply, and that is short term if you look at how policies will have to change going for, I don't know, carbon low or carbon light development policies in our countries and so on. That will be, I don't think really, honestly, that 18 months will be enough, especially when it has to go down the scale. And this leads also to power struggles. How, looking at the proposal of the law and listening to Almut and Myron and the human rights and the like, I'm fearing that what we're doing is actually giving, in the producer landscapes, giving the companies, intermediaries and companies more and more power over what is happening in the lands, on the territory. And how much of the problem, the main problem in the Amazon is still land tenure, land rights, recognition and attribution. So who recognizes that this is indigenous land, for example, and how do I give access to new land and new uses? So I do believe that this might backfire and actually give the companies and intermediaries more and more power. We have seen this. This is one of the studies in my lab on with sustainable gastronomy, that it is basically, this is with fishes. It doesn't have to do with the Amazon, but with fishes and fish-based restaurants. As you know, in Peru, we eat a lot of ceviche and a lot of fish. And one of the things that we found was that the intermediaries had the power and that sustainability did not change that power. So aiming for sustainability, changing producer, so fisher ways to deal, technology and everything did not change the power that the intermediaries had. So if we look at the supply chain of deforestation-free products, are we shifting power to the producers and their use, sustainable or not, but their use of their land? Or are we just generating a more complex supply chain that will probably have more and more complexity and difficulties in the future? And finally, I know this is, everybody talks about it, is traceability. And traceability is just a black box. I mean, technology can help, I'm sure. But even in the place where I'm working right now, Madre Dios, we don't even have a regional unique cadastre. That means that different sectors and different organizations, entities of the government, private sector, civil society, use different information, geospatial information. So that means that conflict is just there all the time. And it's a conflict because we cannot decide on what the information, the basal information should be for this region, for this place, this, we call it region, department actually. And the question is, will we be able to make all the different systems talk to each other in a way that you can really eat a chocolate in Germany or Switzerland and pinpoint the cacao bean all the way to the person who produced it, to the tree that produced it, or the bush that produced it? is that the level of traceability that we need? That's the level of traceability most of the development agencies in, for example, Peru are going for. It's the farmer or the cacao farmer or the coffee farmer. Where did he get his bean and how did it go all the way up to I don't know, a coffee shop in Italy? But the main problem is that is independent of his polygon at the governmental level that acknowledges his property. And that polygon might have very blurring edges that could feed into the other one. So putting or tracing all the products to that sole polygon, from that polygon all the way to Europe, is going to be a feat. And in the deforestation-free commodity law, there is very little to say about how capacities will be built at the producer side of the supply chain. They mentioned that it could be included as part of the risk mitigation effects of a company, for example, in the due diligence process. But how will that be done? What is the distribution of that money? Will it be farmer to company? Will that generate a link that we don't want to have? Will that be a link that because of the capacity development or capacity building or the mitigation efforts that the company has done in that area on those farmers will never be free to sell to any other but to that company because they invested in them? So how is, or will investment go into, I don't know, funding mechanisms at the national level with our corrupt governments? Not to be really amazingly negative there, but we know from history that most of the money that comes is lost through the different channels. So I'm wondering a lot when looking at this, what can we do, or what questions can we ask? And a lot of them are discussions onto what is going to be the effect of this law on the producer side. That is my take. My take is looking at the telecoupling approach, is understanding how these things will ultimately affect the well-being of the landscape of the ecosystems, in this case the forest, and the forest dwellers and the forest dependent communities. So we need scenario analysis, we need some scenario planning, we need also the stakeholders' perspectives. We talk a lot about these sanctions, but not so much about the incentives that there will exist. And will these incentives trickle down all the way to the producer? How will that happen? And to finalize, and this is kind of talking to the elephant in the room, is risk. The place where I work in Madre Dios exports Brazil or Amazon nut, exports several fruits, exports very little, but some rubber. But it's also the illegal source on the Western Amazon of gold, illegal gold. So in looking at the risk, will the risk be measured at the country level? You know, high, middle, low? Will it be at the country level? If it is at the country level, we're screwed as a country. I mean, the risk level of working with cacao or coffee in Madre Dios will be really overblown by the risk of deforestation through mining. So how are we going to manage that? Is the risk going to be to the farmer itself, and the risk will be kind of a red mechanism where you look at the landscapes and try to counterfactuals with it? I don't know. As you see, I've got a lot of questions and very, very few answers. But I suppose that is what keeps us on and doing research and interventions. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That is indeed why we are here, to kickstart this discussion. So trying to summarize all of what you have been saying in the last 40 minutes is going to be a bit of a challenge, but you've also kind of spoken to the challenge of looking at this policy in isolation in relation to what else is going on in the institutional policy landscape locally, nationally, more internationally, and a lot of points on all the negative aspects. So maybe the devil's advocate question here would be, is there anything positive in the EU taking this first or taking this step in towards this kind of regulation implementation? And then we also had a question in the chat related to the cutoff date and the fact that the EU might have silently, in relation to the first initial discussion, pushed it forward. So the cutoff date is now the 31st of January. 31st of December, sorry, 2020. Yeah, Almut, you raised your hand on the positive aspect question.
Yeah, thank you. No, because I think that I understand like all of the critiques, and I also share many of the concerns that Myron and also myself and Armando raised. But I think it's important not to forget that there are also important opportunities that come with these new laws. And I think it's not so simplistic, because I have heard many people like saying, okay, in the end, the companies are the ones who are benefiting from this, and they are so happy about the new laws, and they will like get more power and everything. But I think that's just like one side of the story, because looking at the policy making processes in the European Union, we can see that actually most of the companies have been very critical to the new laws, and they have seen this as a risk and as additional burden, and as different kinds of risks, actually, like reputational risk, legal risks. And if we look at the case of Germany, like here, the companies need to implement due diligence systems now. And they are really, many of them, they don't know how to do it, and they are struggling, they are resisting. So yeah, I mean, it's not so easy, it's not so one-sided. And I think that there are opportunities, because also if we look at the case of France and talking with many NGOs working there, and also talking with companies, like the new law in France is not what people wanted in terms of environmental justice or corporate accountability, but it gives opportunities, and companies have improved grievance systems. Many NGOs told us that now they take their critique more seriously. It's not so easy for them just to say, okay, I don't talk with you. Like, they need to respond to claims. And I think it's also like the discourse that have changed, because before it has been very easy for a mother company like to say, okay, what the subsidiary in a certain country makes, it's not of our business, because they have like their autonomy. But now with the new legal obligations, they are somehow expected to know, and to know the risks and to monitor the risks. So for instance, before, I have been working many years in Bolivia with indigenous communities, and there are companies like Repsol, Total, etc. But for victims of human rights violations or environmental damages, they couldn't really go to the companies in Europe, because they just say, okay, but it's not our business, it's the one of the companies who are there. And this is something that is changing now. Companies from Europe, they are getting more claims and grievances from people in the global south. They are expected to know, they're expected to take that seriously and to act. But okay, I agree that it's a very disbalanced still situation and constellation, so it will not be easy, but I think there are some opportunities. And maybe it's important to activate them and try to struggle and try to make use of them and to know more and raise the awareness, and let's see what could be possible. Because many things also, if we look at France and the new lawsuits that are there, like in France, we have, I think, 7 lawsuits and several formal notices. And there are things being challenged of what companies do. I mean, why Total is not reporting about climate change, why Danone is not reporting about how much plastic they are using. So I don't know, I mean, things are being challenged, and I think that's an opportunity to have this possibility. Yeah.
Thank you, Almut. Myron, do you want to reply quickly to this? And then we have a question from Stefan.
No, absolutely. First, on the cutoff date, someone in the chat had asked. I think the Europeans have always focused on 2020, at least since a couple of years, and this grew in density. The 2008 is the reference, of course, of the Amazon soy moratorium, but if European policymakers thought of mimicking that, which would have been interesting, I think they gave up on it very quickly because it would have been more difficult to compromise. And of course, admitting that everything that was cleared until the end of 2020 is a heck of a lot. So it makes the regulations less effective. And just briefly on the positive side, that I think now, yeah, we're flipping the devil's advocate. It's like we're now the angel's advocate for Europe. But I think definitely there are good things. I think it's still got room to gain momentum in many countries, such as Brazil. People there don't talk about it as much as we who are based in Europe might think, because the main export markets are elsewhere. But I do think these new policies from Europe have helped change the zeitgeist, the paradigm, the way we think about this. And I'll give but one example. Earlier this year, we had a case of modern slavery within Brazil in grape production for local wines and in grape juice and so forth. And of course, there were subsidiaries, and this was big on the media. People wanted to hear no more of this thing. Oh, but it was not me. It's actually the company I hired. So people's tolerance for this kind of argument has vanished. They're like, no. You should have known. If you go ask the popular opinion in Brazil what due diligence is, few people will be familiar with the terminology except those who work with it. But they have bought into the understanding of cascade compliance and due diligence, even when they don't know yet the terminology. So times are changing, and I think a lot of that is because of such policies.
Thank you, Myron. So we're coming very close to the time, but we hope that you will stay with us for a few more minutes. And thank you for participating, those who have to step off sharply here. But Stefan, you had a comment.
Yes, thanks a lot. My name is Stefan Fritz. I'm from IASA. I just wanted to make a few comments. I think it's important. So there was the question raised, on what level the risk assessment is being done. My understanding is this is really on the farmer level. That's why they asking for the polygons, because you can trace back things on the polygon level. So I think that is pretty clear to me that they want to go down to the level of the polygon. But coming back to what you also mentioned, Marion and others, indeed, the Commission is fully aware. So I'm not here to defend the Commission at all. I'm an independent, and we are working for an independent NGO. But I think the Commission is fully aware that it cannot stop just with forests. So there has been a tender out where we have also been participating to go beyond other land. This includes other wooded land, so it would include the Cerrado. For example, also high carbon grassland would be included, and other land as well, which is high biodiversity. So the biodiversity discussion is fully in there. It is in the tender, and it will be addressed. And it is very likely that the EU will go beyond just forests and carbon and will move into other land, as the discussion is also going on other products, not just these 7, but also assessing. But what is important there is the overall contribution it makes. So this was in the tender, for example, if you find out that the contribution of some other land is minimal, then the Commission will not make a regulation because it needs to be substantial. So this assessment, hopefully we will be involved, is absolutely critical for the next directions where the EU is going, and it needs to be done very rigorously. Just one other point, I think there was this mention, to what degree are we going to be able to control things, and what is really important to go beyond the EU, what will China do? And I think this is really critical. I think the idea here is also that there is for the first time now this idea of traceability. It might be imperfect, but the EU doesn't want to be the only one. We are fully clear, this thing will not work. if only the EU is doing this, but it's to set an example potentially for other countries. And here, of course, China is important. So if I'm a company, right, I can declare my polygons. I can declare those polygons which are on the safe side. The other ones, which are more risky, I don't know, there might be deforestation. I will import those products to China, for example, right? So that's what I would do. I mean, I'm just thinking what I would do if I was a company. I would report the safe ones, but there needs to be also not just inspections on the ground if it's deforestation free. I think that's possible, but there needs to be also inspections on the amount declared. So if there is a ship coming, right, the member country is responsible. So if there's a ship coming to Holland, lots of ships are coming into Rotterdam, they need to now decide, you know, here are the polygons. This ship has that many polygons of cacao, for example, right? So somebody needs to then evaluate if this is reasonable, if this actually makes sense, if these amounts of polygons correspond to the amount of cocoa, in this case, shipped to that port. And that is an important component as well as the other inspection. So just wanted to make those points which I think are really relevant. But also then, you know, if you want to go down this blaming and shaming path, I think what is there really critical, and ideally what you want from a company to disclose all their polygons. If that's the case, you know, and maybe that's also what the Commission would need to think about. If there is not all polygons disclosed, you can easily cheat. That's pretty clear to me, right? So all polygons, everything needs to be fully disclosed and not just the ones which import something to the EU. That's my personal view to get this thing working. Okay, I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. Any last comments from any of our speakers on this topic?
There was a short question in the chat for Almut on which Brazil regulation did you talk about at the end of your
yeah, I actually put a response, but maybe it went just to Joyce. Yeah, I spoke about the Progetto Lei 572 from 2022. And it's called Ley Marco Nacional sobre Derechos Humanos y Empresas and something else. Yeah, and it was very interesting because it has a lot of measures for empowering victims of human rights violations and also environment-related human rights violations, and to provide them with access to remedy. And we have seen like similar measures also in law proposals from civil society organizations in the European Union, but they have not been very influential in getting into the laws that have been adopted. So I think there is a lot of room for improving the laws if we want to see change on the ground, and especially the protection of more vulnerable actors in the global south.
Great, thanks a lot. And thank you all for, Armando?
Oh, just a short thing to say that I think Myron hinted is in the big picture is, will the European development agencies, will they align their agendas and their portfolios to what this law will require? So technical and capacity building assistance, but also those things like human rights. I mean, those things, those policies and the like that have to be. We're right now in Peru, we're in a terrible situation where there's a proposal in Parliament to basically take the power that our isolated indigenous law has and reduce it in such a way that a lot of Amazon forest will be open to new company ventures. So that is terrible. But and I think that will happen. Again, it's not the only the deforestation law. Again, it's a great idea. It's a great movement forward, but you've got to understand the whole landscape of different policies that are playing in the case of the Amazon and the different country level and subnational level, and the EU member development agencies if they align their portfolio, if they align their missions to supporting this law to become effective on the ground, that will be a great thing, a great movement. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this round of this very interesting discussion, but I hope we can take this as an invitation to keep the ball rolling. We put 2 invitations in the chat for our new social coffee break format that takes place tomorrow at 2 different times to catch as many of you as possible. And then, yeah, we would just invite you all to approach us with ideas for similar discussion formats or webinars or other themes that we should take up in this forum. But with that, I want to thank you all our speakers for your inputs and all of you for joining, and wish you a good rest of the day wherever you are. So thanks a lot for joining.